All right, I'm Barry Maxwell, and we're going to talk about the contest for Palestine. It took place in the 20th century, and a little bit of the antecedents for that. So, Arabs and Jews, history with this land. Both of them have a lot of history with it, often at different times, but same plot of ground. It's a relatively new conflict between these two peoples. Throughout most of history, they go back a long way as far as existing and coming across each other in the Middle East. They got along fairly well. It wasn't until the early 20th century and this conflict over this plot of ground emerged that they really came into contention with each other. The idea that, they've been fighting with each other for thousands of years over this is not true. So the conflict originally moreover controlled the land and their separate desires to establish their own states there, their self-governing. And it wasn't so much about some dislike for each other's ethnicity or dislike for each other's religion, but again, more about who was going to control the same plot of ground. Both have long-standing ties to this area for various reasons, although usually not at the same time. And both have, at various times in the past, had control of this area also, although neither one of which were able to hold on to it. Both also have very tragic histories at different times at the hands of other outsiders. You've seen quite a bit about various invaders into Arab lands, the Mongols, European, Ottoman Turks, and so on. You know a little bit about some of the problems that Jews have faced in the world in modern times, and their run-ins with others that have mistreated them goes way, way back also. And it's even a further tragedy that two groups that have had so many problems with others have had to fight with each other in an area for ground when they might have shared a lot of sympathy for each other about their similar sorts of histories. Both have claims that both feel are good ones and are legitimate, and there's merit to both claims. It's hard to say that one is better than the other, or one's right, one's wrong, so we're just not going to try and do that here in this class. They do, however, have different perspectives, and of course, like most people with claims, feel that theirs is better. I'll add that this is an emotional issue for many all over the world today. Many in the United States have taken sides in this dispute. It's difficult to discuss it with many who do feel one side is right and the other one's wrong, and therefore, how do you have a debate about the political merits of either side? So in this class, we're, again, not going to do that. We're going to respect the differing views, understand that one can criticize what a Jewish group has done or what the State of Israel does without being anti-Semitic. Likewise, one can criticize Arabs or even specific Muslims without being anti-Muslim. So historic Palestine was an area vaguely defined here that didn't actually wind up with borders until after World War I, when the mandates were established, and pretty much drawn by Great Britain. Great Britain was the one that split the original Palestine mandate into Palestine and creating the area of Jordan. This area has been inhabited for a long time, and Jewish history in it goes back a long way. You've heard some about Arab history already. Well, two maps down there of different Jewish kingdoms at various times. They controlled different plots of land. You'll see in white in the background the modern borders of Israel to give you an example of the size and scope. The Jewish difficulties in this area to some extent started with the Babylonian invasion of 500 BC, drove many out, not all. Rome showed up about 500 years later and attempted to take control, which they did for the most part, despite various Jewish rebellions, one of which caused the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish temple there, and most Jews were driven out of the area. Not all, but they were to remain a tiny minority for the next 2,000 years. So how did they arrive at nationalism, otherwise known as Zionism? A group of people spread out the way they were for 2,000 years. Most such societies would have just disappeared into their surroundings, but Jews did not. maintaining a cultural and religious identity separate from others. I'll point out here that this culture and religion for Jews are not the same thing. One can be an ethnic Jew, consider oneself to be Jewish, and not be a believer in the Jewish religion. So it's possible to be a Jewish atheist. So Jewishness is not only about the religion. For some it is, some it's not. In any case, they managed to maintain their own communities in relatively isolated communities or ghettos, in amongst others that were not Jewish, and for the most part felt themselves to be a people and met the categories of what defines a nation. But not always treated well. Objects of persecution in many cases because they were different, looked different, spoke different, dressed different, acted differently, and therefore also made a convenient political scapegoat when things weren't going well. That local rulers could blame the Jews for crop failures, blame the Jews for bad weather, you name it. And this continues to be a really ugly problem in Russia and Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century. Not that much better in the U.S., some, but wasn't great much of any place for it. However, they weren't getting officially killed and attacked the way they were in Russia with pogroms, and also plenty of just discrimination and limits on where they could live, not live, and so on. So this idea of nationalism starts to grow, the idea that maybe if we had our own place to live, our own state, we wouldn't be treated this way. They fasten, many, not all, but many fasten on Palestine as a place to do that, long-standing cultural ties to Jerusalem and the Old Kingdom of Israel. And while a contentious idea among many Jews, some of which didn't want to have to move there, didn't want their loyalty questioned by the country they were living in, with a, wait a minute, are you British or are you going to be Zionist or Israeli? Where's your country of loyalty to? But the idea persists. So Theodor Herzl, pictured here, sometimes known as the father of Zionism, and he helped, but wasn't the father. Does get a lot of credit though. He's a journalist and originally believed that Jews ought to be able to stay Jewish but assimilate into the wider cultures in which they lived and become members of those cultures and societies rather than live off on their own. But become somewhat disillusioned after a trial in France of a French army captain who was Jewish, and many felt that the charges were trumped up mostly because he was Jewish. So Herzl soon thereafter publishes a book called The Jewish State, outlining his ideas about the establishment of a Jewish home or actual state. Helps organize politically to do this with the First Zionist Congress, out of which comes the following declaration. Now, they weren't quite sure who was going to do this and how it would happen, but they were in the business of going to anybody they could. Herzl visited the Ottoman government several times, British government, anybody that he could that he thought might help bring this about, understanding that at the time he's doing all this, this area is controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so also in this time period you start to get some significant immigration to Palestine. The first Aliyah, which is a Hebrew term meaning historically going up, as one might travel from the coastal plains of Palestine up to into the hills where Jerusalem was. And you get a significant inflow at the latter part of the 1800s, mostly from Russia, where, as we know, things weren't going well. Financed, though, largely by wealthy Jewish community members in Europe, especially Western Europe. And they used money to buy up land from local Arab landowners as well as absent Turkish landowners, which they've got the money and they outbid the local inhabitants. And many of the local inhabitants didn't own the land for the reason that if you owned land, you were subject to being taxed and drafted into the Turkish army. So many locals just did what would today be called sharecropping, i.e., renting the place from the landowner. So when these land purchases took place, the local Arab inhabitants would be told, hey, this is our land now, please leave. You don't own it, we do. We're going to build villages here. The Arabs didn't take too kindly to that, although it was legally done in most cases. You get a second wave as things in Russia are getting especially ugly leading up to their revolution. And in the days just before World War I starts in 1914, here's the ethnic makeup of Palestine. Not a trivial number of Jews, but outnumbered more than 10 to 1 by the number of Arab inhabitants of the place. But there's enough Jews showing up that the Arabs are starting to get somewhat restive and nervous about, hey, what's going on? Why are these guys showing up? Are they going to take it away from us? And they too have their own feelings of nationalism and aspirations, thinking about problems with their Ottoman rulers, and they're not too inclined to have yet another group show up with which they might have. And again, who's going to control the land? So, British support for this idea of a Jewish home becomes significant during World War I. The British government, when things aren't going well for it politically, the war's not going well, the ruling government's worried it's going to get voted out in the next election, is trying to gain local support from Jewish voters by offering up the idea of this Jewish home that they could support, trying to undermine German support for the war by appealing to the significant Jewish population inside Germany to essentially offer them a better deal than what the Germans are going to do, and also trying to keep Russia engaged in the war by trying to appeal to what the British thought was a significant Jewish faction in the Russian revolutionary efforts. So they issued the Balfour Declaration, Lord Balfour being the equivalent of our Secretary of State, and it's a letter to Lord Rothschild, a leading member of the Jewish community in Britain. So, take a look at this. And go ahead and pause it. So, we can see it's short, concise, but also very vague. It says, yeah, we'd like to have a home. Doesn't say what that is, how big it is. It just is vaguely in Palestine, which at this point in time was also vaguely defined. It was written by a committee to try and take into account all the competing political objectives of various groups. Recall that some Jews were and others were concerned about conflicting loyalties between British Jews and Palestinian Jews, and which place would they be loyal to. And they knew that there were plenty of inhabitants living there. It wasn't really a land without a people, despite what some had said. Trying to assuage the possible concerns about those that were living there, but doesn't do a very good job of that either. So this document becomes the basis for their policy for the next 30 years, and a very fraught, bothersome policy that was for them, and they had no idea what they were getting into. So the mandate happens because the British arranged for it to be set up through their voting power in the League of Nations. And these mandates are essentially trusteeships taking Ottoman lands and saying, well, the local inhabitants aren't ready to rule themselves. Eventually they might be, and we're going to give these over to existing countries like France and Great Britain until the local inhabitants are ready. So it's, again, sort of a trusteeship that we're just holding on to it. Well, the French viewed it as a colony, and the British weren't far behind, especially in the Arab areas. The other thing that happens is included in this official mandate is that the wording from the Balfour Declaration that this Palestine will be a Jewish home, or one will be established there rather, and despite Arab objections at the time, and also that a Jewish agency will be established to help further establishment of this Jewish home, whatever that turns out to be. So, boy, the Arabs are really pissed. They felt betrayed by the British, felt they'd been promised their own state there, promised lands there, and don't believe that the British or this new League of Nations that they didn't have any votes in had the authority to be telling them what to do in this regard. So Arabs generally rejected the mandate's legality and the rule of British authority there. Put up with it, but never liked it, and frustrated it when they could. To the point of, and sometimes revolting. Here's the first of several revolts that take place, all of which are put down. The local Jews, though, scared enough of what's going on, worried the British won't be able to protect them, or decide not to, start forming their own secret military. illegal by British law, but they do it anyway. The British, at various times trying to placate the Arabs and get their support, decide to appoint Amin al-Husseini as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, with a budget and a fair amount of political power to wheel and deal various goings-on in Palestine, especially around Jerusalem. But this guy's a real ardent Arab nationalist, doesn't like the British, doesn't want them controlling things. Not clear that he didn't like Jews, but saw Zionism as a competing entity and didn't want that going on either. So the remaining years of the British mandate were a zigzag of attempting to keep the Arabs happy, keep the Jews happy, and they weren't able to do either one very well, often irritating both. First problem that comes out of as they try and placate the Arabs after those rebellions and prevent future ones was the British White Paper, which essentially said that said, okay, we talked about a Jewish homeland, but it's not going to be all of Palestine. There'll be a place for both Arabs and Jews, and we're going to restrict Jewish Palestine can absorb, which wasn't at all what the Jews had in mind, yet wasn't enough to placate the Arabs either, because they wanted outright statehood now. And throughout the 20s, tensions slowly rising as the Jewish immigration is allowed comes in. Again, Arabs concerned that they're going to be outnumbered someday. And the Depression shows up in the 1930s, making life tough for everybody. As well as you have the rising Nazism in Germany and more Jews wanting to get out of more and more ugly conditions there. And this is before World War II starts and the worst of the Holocaust. There are some factions within the local Jewish community in Palestine. They weren't all monolithic and believing and agreeing with each other on everything. Two of the biggest that I'll talk about, the labor Zionist and the revisionist. So the labor Zionist, largely socialist in outlook, politically, thought that didn't completely dump on private property and private enterprise, but saw a bigger role for communally owned things like the kibbutz movement and businesses, and especially a role for the government in regulating all that and moving things along. They were the ones that wound up with control of the Jewish Agency and all its money and political power, and were the ones that were in charge of the Haganah self-defense force, which eventually becomes recognized by the British because they want their help dealing with the Arabs. This group, originally optimistic about maybe working things out with the Arabs, thought that was a possibility at least. And that their best course lay with cooperating with the British, which they do pretty much until the next time a white paper rolls around, which we'll talk about. And probably their main leader, somebody named David Ben-Gurion, which is shown left, the guy standing up, reading by the way, the Declaration of Israel declaring its independence in 1948, becomes their first prime minister, and often thought of as the George Washington of Israel. And labor parties maintain themselves as a main, if not the dominant force in Israeli politics all the way up until the election of 1977. The revisionists are somewhat different, more private property-oriented, more free market. To that extent, might share a lot of feelings with conservatives in America today, although not everything. Very nationalistic, very much wanting their own state, very concerned that it's not going to happen. And that believe that eventually it's going to come down to a fight with the Arabs and probably even the British if they're going to get control of their own land. They're the ones that form the Irgun military force, which eventually becomes viewed as a terrorist organization fighting against the British and Arabs, although that's a little later. And they're the ones, by the way, that are claimed responsibility for bombing the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which is where one of the British administrative headquarters was, killing 91 people, which until the actually the World Trade Center bombing was one of the biggest killings ever up to that time, as far as a terrorist act anyway. The founder, Zev Jabotinsky, pictured upper left, political leader until his heart attack in 1940 kills him. And lower left, standing, is Menachem Begin, who succeeds him, more ardent, more violent, remains a force in Israeli politics, although not a dominant one until he becomes elected prime minister in 1977. And his faction, known as Likud today, remains a force to be reckoned with. Not always a dominant one, but they've been in and out of control of Israel ever since 1977. So, back to the mandate. So, the Jewish community has this agency and some help from outsiders as far as building a future state. The Arabs don't have anything like this, and their refusal to cooperate with the British keeps them really hindered as far as putting together, despite their great numbers, the underpinnings of a future state. So frustrated are they by this that they conduct what starts as general strike, refusal to pay taxes, turns into an open rebellion, an ugly one, which the British eventually put down by killing thousands of Arabs, deporting many thousands more. And this has the effect of largely removing any Arab leadership from the area at a very critical time as they head into World War II and the War for Independence, Jews versus Arabs later. So they're somewhat of a disadvantage despite their greater numbers after this. The British, despite having put the rebellion down and harking back to 1920 rebellion and their 1922 white paper, try again. This time they're very worried about the coming World War II. Don't know when it's going to happen yet, but they know it's coming, and very anxious to gain Arab support, where a lot of their oil comes from Iraq, the Suez Canal in Egypt, various assets in Arab countries. They don't want problems there if they have to fight Germany. So this white paper attempts to gain Arab support worldwide. The British make an explicit promise of a Palestinian state by 1949. Even further limit Jewish immigration and limit land sales to Jews and drop any intent to form a separate Jewish state. Now they say that Jews will participate in this new state, but clearly won't be in control of it. Now the Jews are incensed because they feel their promises have been broken. The Arabs don't think it's enough, not fast enough, so they don't cooperate either. And the Jews do continue to cooperate because they're even more frightened of Germany than they are of the British at this point, and work with the British until they're safe from a possible German invasion after the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt in 1942, which removed a real possibility of the Germans coming across Africa through Egypt and up into Palestine. As Ben-Gurion put it, we'll fight with the British in the war as if they'd not done this white paper, and we'll fight there was no war going on. However, as the war ends, violence escalates. The British become more and more a target of Jews and Arabs, and they're tired of the war, tired of conflict everywhere, especially tired of getting shot at by both sides in this opening civil war, and they want out. So they declare that they're leaving. The date is going to end May of 1948. They'll be out of there no matter what, and ask the United Nations, newly created, to solve this problem. Give them about a year and a half. UN comes up with this partition plan, voted on and approved by the General Assembly, to establish two states, both ethnically defined, one Jewish, one Arab, pictured here. With the gray area around Jerusalem to be an internationally administered area that wouldn't be part of either state. Broken down as follows. You'll notice that the Jewish state, somewhat larger, has a majority of Jews in that state, but a very hefty Arab minority. The Arab state, mostly Arab, a few Jews, and the Jews reluctantly accept this. They were hoping for more land. The Arabs reject it outright. The surrounding Arab countries oppose it also. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, hard to say, no other country outside agrees to come in and enforce this plan on the local inhabitants. Again, Britain and the U.S. too tired and spent from World War II. Populations aren't ready for this kind of foreign involvement, and so the plan is never implemented. It just passes into history as one more legal document that tried to solve this issue. So, again, late 47, early 1948, as the British are preparing to leave, the conflict escalates. All the groups locally and some that come in from outside trying to get as much territory as they can for when the mandate ends, and nobody's sure what's happening after that because there's no follow-on legal procedure. So you get some pretty intense fighting in the Arab city of Jaffa, which is next to Tel Aviv. Jews trying to drive them out. Don't want a threat right next door to what's going to be their capital city, at least for a while. Tel Aviv being on the coast, if you recall from the map. The Jews had developed something called Plan Daleh, which was their intent to clear a corridor between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem by taking out Arab villages that might threaten road communications and transport, and also some other areas. Hotly debated as far as whether or not this was ethnic cleansing or not, but again, there was some intent to clear Arabs from at least some places. In here, the more nationalist Irgun from the revisionist faction conducts its massacre of Arabs at the village of Deir Yassin. And there's atrocities committed on both sides. Hard to say who was worse. Maybe the Arabs, but again, plenty of blame to go around. All of this violence triggers a huge exodus of Arabs from Palestine. Some 700,000 are the estimates. And they move into refugee status in various places, and is known by them today as the Nakba, or catastrophe, as sort of the loss of their homeland. The British leave is scheduled on 15 May. Israel declares itself a state. The forces from the surrounding Arab countries, to some extent, invade Palestine, hoping to grab this free land that's suddenly up for grabs, among other things. And the fighting continues, and the contest goes on.